As we begin our journey through 2021, I thought it would be appropriate to spend maybe a few weeks looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and particularly the section that we know as the Beatitudes. I've entitled my talk for today, A Legacy of Happiness. I was a young child, and the glorious anticipation of being smothered in Christmas riches consumed me. The pages of our Eaton's and Simpson Sears Christmas catalogs were worn dog-eared from my hours of devouring their tantalizing offerings. As I declared yet another item to add to my growing list of Christmas expectations, my mother described to me one of her own recollections of a childhood Christmas. To my horror, she told me that the extent of her Christmas riches that year consisted of one mandarin orange and one ordinary yellow school pencil. I struggled to comprehend why she didn't appear regretful as she talked about that Christmas. Instead, an introspective smile fell over her face as she relived the memory of her father's loving gesture, which served to highlight the fact that he would have liked to have given much more. They were, however, a large family, and the Great Depression had ensured that there wasn't enough money for the basics of living, much less for extravagant gifts. I wasn't sure if I should feel guilty or grateful that I had no personal knowledge of such poverty. I was, after all, the spoiled youngest child of a family which was decidedly not poor. But I couldn't shake the image of my mother's happy contemplation as she recalled what for me seemed like a most unhappy Christmas. And I couldn't quite manage to dislodge the troubling thought that my personal pursuit of happiness was misguided. With my parents being products of the Depression, I grew up on a steady diet of Depression stories, along with sober reminders that I should never take ease of life for granted. Those stories have taken on new meaning. Like the Great Depression, 2020 has created fodder for story that those who are children now will pass on to their own children. My mind doesn't have to work very hard to conjure up images of my presently young grandchildren telling their future children about the sacrifices they were forced to make in 2020. I simply remember my parents' stories. I wonder, will those future stories be laced with sadness? Or will the hardships they recall also have a happy note as they remember close family experiences? The pursuit of happiness is so basic to human existence that it's enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence. These well-known words don't fail to deliver an emotional shiver. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those words remind us that happiness is an elusive goal. When we take inventory of what has brought us happy memories, it's not always what we would look for in the future. But the most life-altering words about happiness are not contained in the American Declaration of Independence. The most life-altering words about happiness were spoken by Jesus. According to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus quickly acquired a large following, likely because he was healing people who were paralyzed, who had seizures, who were demon-possessed, and who were in pain. No doubt, Jesus' miracles represented the promise of happiness to his followers. Jesus, though, didn't want to be known as only a miracle worker. Jesus was a teacher. A miracle changes a situation, but teaching changes people. Matthew 5 tells us that the time came when Jesus found a good place from which to teach, and he sat down, surrounded by his followers. Who would have anticipated that the very first topic of Jesus' instruction would be the pursuit of happiness? We call Jesus' whole teaching there the Sermon on the Mount, and the opening segment about happiness we call the Beatitudes. Listen to Jesus' words, and if you're familiar with a traditional reading of the Beatitudes, you will understand why I have chosen to quote them using this particular translation from the Common English Bible. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him. He taught them, saying, "Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, because they will see God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed, because they are righteous. Let me read that again. Happy are people whose lives are harassed because they are righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult you and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you, all because of me. Be full of joy and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. In the same way, people harassed the prophets who came before you." That's from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, the first 12 verses. Now, my trusty Greek lexicon tells me that the word that is traditionally translated blessed could as easily be translated happy. But simply substituting the word happy for the word blessed doesn't make Jesus' teaching any more palatable. How can anyone who is hopeless or grief-stricken or hungry and thirsty or insulted and harassed, how can they possibly be happy? Or for that matter, how could the memory of an impoverished Christmas bring my mother a happy recollection? The disconnect, of course, with those unhappy sounding situations is that Jesus' teaching also included the actual elements of what we normally associate with happiness: receiving the kingdom of heaven, being made glad, getting a large inheritance, being well fed, receiving mercy, witnessing God's activity in our lives are all components of happiness. What we have trouble with is Jesus' prescription for getting there. None of us include being harassed within our own personal pursuit of happiness. Undoubtedly, Jesus' intent was to teach that our instinctive ways of pursuing happiness will not produce the end result for which we are looking. Our problem is that by nature we are selfish beings who assume that the fulfillment of happiness is found through feeding that selfishness. Yeah, we don't even need Jesus to tell us that. Way back in 1977, Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson sang, "We've been so busy keeping up with the Jones, 4-car garage and we're still building on. Maybe it's time we got back to the basics of love." Too often, though, the awareness of our own selfishness is too faint to change our approach to life. Despite our best intentions, we get seduced into building our own kingdoms rather than anticipating being blessed with the kingdom of heaven. As I approach my senior years, I have to confess that the pull of feeding my selfish desires has not lessened. Maybe it's even intensified. At their core, Jesus' words were one of the strongest indictments against selfishness we can find anywhere. Any honest consideration proves that having our selfish wish list filled doesn't guarantee happiness. The wealth of my childhood Christmas treasures failed to measure up to my mother's Depression era memories. As Jesus said, it's the harassed, the ones who grieve, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. They're the ones whose lives become the fertile environments which cultivate the reward of happiness. A word that has become very important to me as I age, and particularly since some medical scares have awakened my own sense of mortality, it's the word legacy. Much more than our accumulations, our legacy has the power to endure when we are no longer present. Our legacy determines the impact we leave on the world. When I was young, I paid little attention to the concept of legacy. My, my life stretched out before me toward what felt like an infinitely distant horizon. But with age, that horizon looms ever closer. Do I have regrets? I certainly do. I cringe when I remember legacy damaging errors I have made. Building a legacy is like growing a retirement fund. It's best to begin as young as possible. The Beatitudes challenge us to be very intentional about building our legacies because an unselfish legacy is really the only true fountain of happiness. According to Jesus' words, the single most damaging influence on our personal legacy is selfishness. Simply stated, selfishness will keep us from discovering the happiness Jesus taught is available. We can't be merciful and selfish at the same time. We can't be humble and selfish at the same time. We can't be peace builders, and be selfish at the same time. Without being merciful, humble, and peaceful, we can't build a legacy of genuine happiness. Some of the people who have intrigued me in this regard are Bill and Melinda Gates. They have decided that their legacy will be what they give away rather than even the business that they built. Despite being fabulously wealthy, whenever they are interviewed, it's very clear that what brings them happiness is giving away their wealth to help disadvantaged people. Over the years, they are credited with donating upwards of 45 billion with a B billion dollars. And they do that toward humanitarian efforts. Jesus was right when he taught that selfishness and happiness end up being mutually exclusive. Our human nature dictates that none of us are capable of completely eradicating happiness, robbing selfishness from our lives. Jesus, though, through his life empowering teaching, laid out the pathway to escaping the damaging impact of selfishness through building an unselfish legacy. None of us have enjoyed 2020. Does that mean that 2020 was incapable of producing happiness? Not according to Jesus' teaching, because 2020 allowed plenty of opportunity to uncover humility, mercy, and peacemaking. In case I'm starting to sound sanctimonious, I regretfully confess that I was one of 2020's biggest complainers. There is yet no guarantee that 2021 will be any less challenging than 2020. But if we embrace Jesus' challenge to build our own unselfish legacy, we can guarantee that we will cultivate happiness that we would not have thought possible.